5. Night crept in on the strange marooned group. Single campfires emerged from the gloom like vague, one-eyed monsters. Chewing silently on some emergency rations, Takuda sat alone by his own fire. Then he looked up at the unfamiliar sky and realized that it had only been a few hours since he'd completed his inspection of the Teledyne back at Salford, confident that he was heading toward a known destination in a known universe. Now, he was somewhere else, had not the faintest idea where. His universe, his known, concrete, real universe, had disappeared in a single jolt. He was a man with no past, only a present and an unknown future, if he had any future at all. Dawn came, and Shosa Yubari Takuda shook himself and stretched his legs. During a near sleepless night, he had struggled with the question of whether they should even go on any longer, but his very soul rebelled at the question. Of course they should go on. Of course he should go on. Seppuku was an honorable end for a warrior, but it was not acceptable as an escape from responsibility. And Takuda was now responsible for the lives of the 12 members of his Draconis elite strike team, as well as those of the 11 mercenaries and the 4 crew members of the dropship and jump ship. All told, 27 people who would have to learn to live out their lives in harmony. Takuda made a quick mental review of his own team. The headquarters included himself, his aide, Socho Saitan Yura, and Gunso George Busteau. They had been with him for years and would follow his orders to the death. Under normal circumstances, so would the whole team, but Takuda thought their present situation could hardly be classified as normal. The 3 operational sections of the team were all headed by Gunso Talon sergeants of considerable experience. Sean Arsenault, leader of the first section, spent slightly too much time worrying about his appearance, but he was unflappable and cheerful. Emmerdine Knight, the second section leader, was intelligent and introspective. He would have and should have been an officer, the type of man who had showed quiet leadership by example. He was another one who would take all things as they came. Ariake Sene led the weapons team. She was as upright as any commander could wish, but had a tendency to be hidebound on questions of religion. She had no sense of humor, and except in matters military, had no use for Knight. The mercenaries Takuda knew less well. He'd had direct contact only with Garber Vost, their leader, and the man was everything Takuda most despised in life. Vost was a braggart who treated the other mech pilots with only slightly veiled disdain. Holly Goodall, the only female mech warrior among them, he treated with open contempt. Why she had joined the mercenary unit was a mystery, but Takuda knew that mech warriors, particularly the mercenary variety, were a breed unto themselves. Of the technicians who served the merc unit, Takuda knew only that they were 6 in number, half of them female. All seemed to pay the mercenary leaders special attention. The ship crews were another unknown. Parker DeVood, the dropship pilot, was certainly a professional of the highest order. To be able to land his ship with virtually no controls, and then to keep it from breaking up on impact, was evidence enough. That he was slightly causal with command structure was understandable. Dropship pilots were like that, casual. Bannon, the master and commander of the jump ship, rated much lower. The man had fallen apart during the crisis, and Takuda could expect little of him now. The navigator and engineer of the jump ship were better, but they were ciphers as far as what they could contribute to the future. The divergent group would have to work together to survive. It was certainly not the group Takuda would have chosen if he'd had the choice, but they were what fate had handed him. He rose to his feet and surveyed the area. The various camping areas reflected the attitudes of the members. The desk areas were almost invisible among the grass and bushes that dotted the open area. Takuda was sure the weapons of each section were unlimbered and deployed. The mercenary camp, on the other hand, was a hive of activity, completely visible to inspection by any alien who might be hiding in the distant trees. The pilot group had not moved from under the crumpled wing of the dropship. As Vost left the mercenary camp and came toward Takuda, the Shosaw felt rather than saw Yura and Busteau of the headquarters section approaching from his rear. They would, he knew, remain at a respectful distance, out of range of all but the most strident voices, but ready to lend silent and well-armed support. "Well, Major," said Vost, using the universal ranking system rather than the traditional Kirita ranks, "we seem to find ourselves in strange circumstances." Takuda gazed serenely at the other man. He had learned from vast experience that silence was often the best reply. He also knew that Vost would continue with his pre-programmed speech no matter what was said in return. He was correct. "Situation has changed since yesterday, or whenever it was. My men and I were employed by the Draconis Combine as a complete lance. We were to participate in an action you people did not feel qualified to perform. My contract states that we would be paid half our fee upon signing, and half on completion of the mission. You people were responsible for our safe insertion and extraction. As I see it, you have not fulfilled your part of the contract. What do you say to that?" "I have no knowledge of the complete contract," replied Takuda in a level voice. "I was given my own mission regarding your lance." This was not totally true, of course. He had been charged not only with the mercenaries' insertion, but in seeing that they completed their mission. The dropship contained the documentation and the money to pay Vost once his lance had completed their work. But Vost was not to know this in advance, and as far as Takuda was concerned, his own orders were still in effect. Disclosing his knowledge would have an unfortunate effect on Harmony. "Well, I have my copy of the contract," said Vost, reaching inside his vest. Takuda felt the slight stiffening of his vigilant men, then felt them relax when the mercenary pulled out a scroll instead of a weapon. "I have no need to read your copy, Pilot Vost. I assume that you are telling me the truth, but I do not see that the situation has changed that radically." "Well, I say the contract is now void, and the rest of my people agree." "You vote on issues?" Takuda raised a quizzical eyebrow. "We don't vote, but I do listen to what they have to say." Takuda smiled. What Vost really had said was that he told his people what he wanted them to say, and then they said it. It was an interesting form of leadership. "Well then, and what do your people have to say?" "First, the contract is null and we're on our own. Since you failed to deliver us to our destination, we have no further need of you or your desk team. It also makes your authority here superfluous. We are perfectly able to direct ourselves. Your people can disband and join my technicians." "Disband?" "They are useless, are they not? This is not a combat situation. What we need are people who know how to work. My techs are just the ones to do it. We can teach your people how to survive." "Mr. Vost, my team consists not only of highly skilled assault troops, but all are mech qualified. What's more, each one has been trained to survive alone in any type of environment. That persuades me to believe that survival depends on maintaining our current structure," replied Takuda. With you in charge, you mean? So that's the problem, thought Takuda. What rankled Vost was the question of command structure. Takuda was beginning to feel better. At least he knew what was happening. So, if you're in charge, continued Vost, what do you plan to do about the women? I didn't know we had to do anything about the women. That's your real problem, Major. Vost had a sneer on his face that Takuda had seen before when civilians wanted to patronize a member of the military. We're here forever, said Vost. He planted his fists on his hips and threw out his chest. And forever is something you will have to understand. If we're going to survive at all, we will have to deal out the women to the best men, which should be done immediately. I don't understand the we in your statement. We, the ones in charge, you and me and maybe Bannon, although I think he's going to be useless. You and me. What about the women? What about the women? The women will do as they're told, of course. Really? In the Draconis Combine, we do not treat women as chatter. We're not in the Draconis Combine anymore, Major. This is somewhere else, and our long-term survival is at stake. Vost shook his head. Remember what Bannon said last night. We're not going anywhere. This is all new. New world, Major. Get with it, man. Takuda had no answer. Vost was right about one thing. This was a new world and a new situation. Everything the Shosaw had ever known had come to a complete and abrupt end. There was no Combine to whom he must answer, to whom he could answer. There was no one above him, as there had always been. His entire life had been built on a hierarchy of people, each one answering to an authority a step above, and each one responsible to those a step below. Well, the step below remained, but the one above had vanished. Of one thing he was sure, though. These mercenaries were incapable of rising above self-interest. The sole reason they'd been hired for their mission was because they possessed a land-air mech, a piece of equipment that would have been invaluable to the reconnaissance aspect of their mission. Lambs had become as rare as they were valuable because no one in the inner sphere produced those machines any longer. The mercenaries had also been chosen because they would be expendable if their mission failed. I will think about it, was all Takuda would say. We shall see. You bet we will, said Vost, and we'll see about it pretty quick. The situation changed slightly later that day. Takuda had sent out patrols to see what the woods had to offer, and the scouts had reported an abundance of what looked like edible fruit. They had not been bold enough to try any of them, but had brought back a significant pile of various types. The last patrol in, the one from Knight's section, brought even more interesting news. Knight reported that Horg and Holland, the two members of his section who had gone into the woods, had made contact with a large animal. Holland had taken a shot at it, but had missed. The animal had vanished into the woods, leaving almost no trail, but it had cried out at them as it fled, and the cry had sounded almost human.